we're diving into something really foundational, a story I think most of us sort of take for granted in Western
Yeah,
history.
exactly. It's the classic story of the Reformation. Martin Luther, this really heroic figure, totally outraged because the Catholic Church was supposedly selling forgiveness, these bits of paper, indulgences.
Like receipts for salvation. Yeah, that's the common picture.
But you sent us sources arguing that this whole selling forgiveness thing, it might be, well, closer to historical propaganda.
That's the core challenge in these materials, yeah. So our mission today, our deep dive, is to unpack this. Was Luther really just fighting financial corruption?
Or the pretext for a much bigger, maybe even pre-planned revolt against church authority itself.
And to even start thinking about that, we absolutely have to do what the sources insist on. We need to clearly separate the official Catholic doctrine on indulgences,
The theology bit.
right, the theology, from the abuses that were happening in practice, how they were actually being sold or preached in the late Middle Ages.
One's the idea, the other's the messy reality on the ground.
Precisely. Because if we conflate those two, we completely miss the point the sources are trying to make. That common idea you mentioned, selling tickets out of hell, or literally selling forgiveness. That's the core piece of propaganda we need to examine.
Okay, let's tackle that head on then. If indulgences weren't about forgiving the actual sin, what were they for, according to the official teaching? Because that's the bit people usually gloss over.
Right. So doctrinally, they were strictly about the remission of temporal penalties due to sin. To get this, you really need to think about how the church understood dealing with sin in, like, 2 stages.
2 stages.
Okay. Stage 1 is forgiveness of the sin itself, removing the guilt. That, the sources stress, happens only through God's grace via the sacrament of confession through absolution.
So justification. No money involved there.
Absolutely none. No indulgence needed for justification, for the actual forgiveness of guilt. That's purely sacramental.
But, okay, the sin is forgiven, but there's still fallout, like consequences or damage done.
Exactly. And that brings us to stage 2, which is called satisfaction. Even after your guilt is wiped clean, you might still owe something, a sort of debt or penalty, to repair the harm caused.
Harm to yourself or others, or just cosmic justice?
Kind of all of the above. And traditionally, the priest would assign penance to help address this, things like prayers, fasting, acts of charity, good works. That's the satisfaction part.
Okay, I think I see the distinction now. It's a bit like, say, a judge pardons someone for vandalism. The crime's off their record, guilt gone.
Right.
But they might still have to do community service, maybe repaint the wall they damaged. That's the temporal penalty, the satisfaction.
That's a really good analogy, actually. Perfect. Indulgences were only supposed to deal with that second part, the community service, the leftover penance.
So shortening or fulfilling that required satisfaction after the main forgiveness, the justification, had already happened.
Precisely. And the church based this authority on, well, theological concepts like the treasury of merit and its power to bind and loose, which they trace back to biblical passages like Matthew 16.
What's really interesting, though, is the sources point out this wasn't initially about money at all. Originally, it was tied to quite serious spiritual acts, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely not about money originally. For centuries, getting an indulgence involved undertaking something significant, spiritually demanding.
Like what?
Like serious fasting, giving substantial amounts to the poor, genuine almsgiving, or performing major works of mercy, or even dangerous pilgrimages, walking hundreds of miles to a major shrine like Santiago de Compostela.
Real effort, real sacrifice.
Exactly. The idea was to integrate that need for satisfaction back into a person's spiritual journey. The sources really emphasize that the core doctrine itself, when you strip away the later problems, was considered orthodox and had deep historical roots. By Luther's time, that line between making a spiritual contribution like alms and just a financial transaction
had gotten blurry.
And this got sped up significantly by these hired preachers, professional fundraisers, essentially. Their main job was raising money for big projects.
Like the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome.
That's the most famous example, yes. And this is where we meet Johann Tetzel. He's become the sort of poster child for this whole issue.
The main villain in the traditional story.
Pretty much. And by all accounts, his methods were crude. They were theatrical, designed to get a reaction, and often, let's say, theologically simplistic, if not misleading.
He was trying to get people to open their wallets.
That was his job, yes. And this is where that infamous slogan comes in, the one everyone quotes, though the sources stress it was not official teaching.
As soon as the coin in the coffer rings.
The soul from purgatory springs. That's the one.
It's incredibly catchy, and it sounds exactly like selling salvation, or at least a fast track out of purgatory.
It absolutely does,
Yeah.
and the sources label it perfectly. A vulgar marketing jingle. That's all it was, designed for maximum impact
Because it skips a crucial step.
completely.
Yeah.
It ignored the absolute doctrinal requirement that the person getting the indulgence had to have already gone to confession, been truly repentant, and received absolution for their sins first.
So the jingle made it sound like the money itself did the trick. Instant results.
Exactly. A gross oversimplification, equating a donation with immediate spiritual release. It was bad theology and, frankly, bad practice.
Okay, but here's the really critical question the sources need to answer, and I think you, the listener, are probably asking this too. If this was so obviously wrong, doctrinally speaking, why did the church hierarchy, why did Rome seem to let Tetzel and others get away with it for so long? Doesn't it suggest profit won out over principle?
That's the natural conclusion to draw, but the sources argue it's more complicated. They draw a distinction between, say, local enforcement problems and central church policy or intent. They argue the church wasn't just idly ignoring it.
They were trying to fix it.
Yes, there were attempts already underway to address the abuses before Luther even hammered his theses to the door.
What kind of attempts?
Well, various popes, like Sixtus V back in the late 15th century, and even Leo X, the pope during Luther's time, had issued bulls condemning overly crude or mercenary preaching of indulgences.
Okay, papal statements. But were they effective?
Maybe not always on the ground level. But perhaps more significantly, there was systemic reform being discussed through the church councils. Specifically, the Fifth Lateran Council, Lateran V.
Lateran V, when was that?
It ran from 1512 right up to March 1517. And its agenda explicitly included calling for reform and restraint in how indulgences were preached. It also tackled broader issues, like simony buying church offices and bishops not living in their diocese.
Okay, wait. March 1517. Luther posts his 95 Theses in October 1517.
Exactly. The timing is incredibly important here. Lateran V was wrapping up its work just as Luther was making his public protest.
So the argument is Luther wasn't necessarily attacking a completely corrupt, stagnant church that refused to see the problem.
He was striking while the church was already engaged, maybe slowly, maybe imperfectly, but officially engaged in an internal process to reform the very abuses he was highlighting.
That does change the picture. It suggests Luther's protest wasn't just about cleaning up Tetzel's act. It must have gone deeper or escalated very quickly.
That's precisely the argument. Indulgences, the financial corruption aspect, became the visible trigger, the moral high ground, the pretext.
For something else.
For a much more fundamental, comprehensive doctrinal revolt. Initially, yeah, the 95 Theses mostly focused on the abuses, on the bad preaching and the money side.
Which is why Rome didn't immediately panic.
Right. The Pope apparently first saw it as, another squabble among monks or a call to discipline bad preachers, which was fairly routine business.
So when did it really shift? When did it become a full-blown Reformation?
According to these sources, it shifted very quickly. Luther moved rapidly from criticizing the practice of indulgences to attacking the very foundation, meaning he started questioning the Pope's authority to grant indulgences in the first place, then the authority of church councils, and eventually questioning the entire sacramental system, the role of penance, the nature of salvation itself.
Okay, so it stops being about Tetzel counting coins.
And starts being about who has divine authority, what salvation actually is, and how we achieve it. That's the pivot.
A massive shift from ethics to fundamental theology and authority.
Absolutely. Because once you deny the Pope's authority, the whole system built on it, like the treasury's merit, starts to crumble. You need a new framework.
And this is where the deeper philosophical change comes in. The sources mention something about nominalism.
Yes, exactly. The sources argue that the real driver wasn't just the indulgence issue, but a fundamental shift in underlying philosophy and theology that Luther represented. He moved away from the traditional Catholic view,
Which was?
which broadly speaking saw human reason and free will as capable of cooperating with God's grace, a kind of synergy, towards something quite different,
Okay.
towards a voluntarist, nominalist understanding. Now, without getting lost in medieval philosophy, think of it like this. Instead of cooperation, this view emphasizes God's absolute sovereign will. Salvation isn't something you cooperate in. It's decreed by God unilaterally. Human reason will play a much smaller or even non-existent role in achieving it.
So if it's all God's absolute will, and salvation is purely by faith alone sola fide, as Luther argued.
Things like doing penance, works of satisfaction, trying to make up for sin.
Yeah.
They become theologically unnecessary,
Yeah.
or even problematic.
And the human will, does it even matter if it's all pre-decreed?
Precisely. And you see this culminate in Luther's later, very stark work on the bondage of the will, where he explicitly denies that humans have free will.
Wow.
You don't end up denying free will, kicking books out of the Bible, fundamentally restructuring Christian belief and practice.
All because you were initially upset about a dodgy fundraising campaign for a building project.
Exactly. The sheer scale of the theological revolution Luther initiated strongly suggests the initial disagreement was far deeper than just the practice of selling indulgences.
So the corrupt indulgence system story, while having a kernel of truth about the abuses,
Becomes, in this view, the convenient, emotionally powerful narrative, maybe even exaggerated propaganda, used to justify introducing a radically different theological and philosophical system.
a system based on this voluntarist, perhaps Occam-influenced idea of God's absolute will.
That's the synthesis emerging from these particular sources. Acknowledging the reality of the abuses, yes, but seeing the core driver as a profound dispute over dogma, authority, the nature of grace, and the role of human will.
Right. So recapping for everyone listening, the sources challenge the simple story. They argue the indulgence controversy was less the cause of the Reformation and more the occasion for a deeper philosophical break.
A break rooted in differing views on fundamental questions about God, humanity, reason, and will.
Which forces us to reconsider the Reformation's origins. Maybe less about a purely moral crusade against external corruption.
And more about an internal, profound clash of theological and philosophical worldviews influenced by late medieval thought currents like nominalism, associated with thinkers like William of Ockham.
So here's the final thought we want to leave you with, something to chew on from these sources.
If the primary split wasn't just about fixing financial or ethical scandals, but was actually driven by these deep, abstract philosophical disputes about God's will versus human reason, about whether we have free will in salvation.
Does that change how you think about the legacy of the Reformation? Does it alter how you see the reformers themselves, or maybe even how theological ideas have shaped, the path to our modern world, including secular thought?
It suggests the roots of major historical shifts can lie in places we don't always look, not just in politics or economics, but deep within theology and philosophy.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive, wrestling with that crucial, often misunderstood difference between justification and satisfaction and the complex story behind the 95 Theses.